Right, a massive welcome to everybody. Gosh, the first results grassroots call of 2024. Um, I feel that 2023 went really fast, and I've no doubt that this year will be the same. So this month we're going to be looking at a pretty big topic, which is how does results kind of position itself rather for the future, which and kind of the need to continue to address the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. And obviously, it's very little time now before they're supposed to be reached in 2030. So there's a couple of big kind of questions. If this is your first time on one of our results monthly conference calls, then a special welcome to you. My name's Naveed Chowdhury. I'm the head of campaigns at Results UK, and I chair these regular calls. They're usually held on the first Tuesday of each month to discuss the latest advocacy action and how we think that action will help make a difference to the issues we're working on. But this first month of the year, we've changed it so that we can have Kitty with us, and more on that in a minute. So we discuss the issues each month, we talk about how they can help, and also we spend time with each other together as a network. And this first call of the year is usually a bit different in that we do look forward to the whole year and thinking about planning what the bigger picture will be like and how you might be able to contribute your own advocacy to and make your own plan for kind of what are going to be the global poverty issues that we think we need to work on this year. So before we get into any of that, I'm going to start with the usual housekeeping messages. So please keep yourself muted if you can during the call. If you've got any questions or comments, we'll try and deal with that through the chat box. As always, we're recording this call, and if you'd prefer not to be visible, then please do turn your video off. That's all fine. If you're new to the call, please introduce yourself if you haven't already, if you'd like to, by unmuting and saying hello, or just using the chat function. It doesn't matter. We'd love to hear where you're calling from, but it's also fine just to stay in the background either way. Well, welcome everybody anyway. So I'd just like to remind you that as we started doing towards the end of the last year, we'll be keeping this call open after the formal meeting ends at 9 p.m. for an extra half hour, just so that anyone who wants to can stay and chat informally with each other after the end of the meeting. So now on to a quick review, as we usually do, of what's been happening in the world that affects the work of Results. Obviously, possibly a little bit less than normal because we've had the Christmas and New Year break. Oh, hello, Vas. I've just seen you say hello in the call. Welcome. In the chat box, rather. I'm going to mention a few things that are coming up and things that we know we're going to be working on at some point this year, even if we don't yet have the details or the dates on which we need you to take action. Then a bit later on the call, I'm going to introduce our CEO, Kitty, who will address the broad strategic direction that we're setting for ourselves as an organisation. I think it's fair to say that 2023 was a mixed year in terms of engaging the UK government in tackling global poverty. And of course, there were many competing challenges, including the ongoing conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza, economic instability and cost of living, both in the UK and around the world, and a very turbulent UK political scene, to name just a few issues that we've had to contest with. Bulana, welcome, as you've already said hello earlier on. Welcome to you. Welcome to Kemi as well. Thank you for saying hello in the chat. So yeah, quite a lot of challenges, and I had to double check actually that Liz Truss only resigned as PM in October 2022, which means that we've had just about over a year to get the attention of the current government, which is not a huge amount, but in that time there have been some positive changes, I would say. First, the appointment of Andrew Mitchell as Development Secretary was widely seen as a good thing, as in him we have someone who knows and cares deeply about international development issues. And in November, we also have in David Cameron, a Foreign Secretary who's also committed to international development, for example, having started the Nutrition for Growth agenda back in 2013. So both of those ministers have a really good track record there, in those respects at least. So an example of this bearing fruit relatively quickly was the UK government's Global Food Security Summit on the 20th of November, which I think we mentioned just before Christmas. Whilst we're nowhere near meeting the scale of the increased global challenges around malnutrition, it sent an important signal about the UK's response to an increasing volatility of food supplies, and also kind of the longer term prospects of for nutrition. So whilst we've shared this link before, I'm going to share the details again in the chat box, just to, if anyone wants to go and kind of look at that. This is the kind of government announcement I'm just going to put in the chat. If you want to look at that, and it also include a broader, refreshed approach to international development in the government's new white paper. So hopefully, well, is intended to guide us over the remainder of this Parliament. What will happen in terms of the election, we don't know. Before I move on to what's coming this year, though, I do want to remind you of some of the successes that we as a network have had together. And I do believe that things are starting to move in a more positive direction after several years in which we've seen the UK's role in international development going steeply downwards. So I feel positive, maybe others don't. We can chat about that a bit later on. Last year, you helped to influence public debate around refugees and asylum seekers, which had been, I think, taking increasingly negative overtones and helping shift the argument by speaking about the need to protect vulnerable people seeking safety, as well as the most marginal people around the world, and not having those two in opposition. And that felt really important. More recently, you helped to push for an important debate in Parliament, allowing MPs to show their support for the Sustainable Development Goals, which is really essential framework for building a fairer world. And your campaigning efforts also contributed to a pledge towards the end of the year from the UK government at December's Global Refugee Forum, with £4 million pledged for support for education for refugee children. And then let's not forget a much larger sum of money, actually. Persuaded by results and others, the UK government also announced a surprise package of nearly £500 million at the UN in September for global health, including research and development into diseases of poverty and treatments for those. That's something we've been pushing for a long time now. And this topic continues to be as important as ever. So that very large sum of money was, yeah, a bit of a surprise and a really good thing. So your advocacy on global issues over the last year has continued to make a big difference. Thank you so much. So now I want to move on to the kind of opportunities we have to influence things in 2024, we think. And whilst we don't yet have all the details, as I said, we think that we're quite likely to need to ask you for help on these things this year. Now, with these positive signs of a refocusing on international development by the UK government, I think we still need to do more work in 2024 for the UK to regain its previously held role as a respected development partner around the world, and to contribute the UK's proper share of the efforts needed to achieve the SDGs by 2030. So, for example, we might think about making sure that those commitments made in the November Food Systems Summit become a concrete reality. And one opportunity where we might be able to do that is at the next Nutrition for Growth conference, which we believe is going to be held in France in June. They're usually held around the Olympics. So that could be an opportunity for us to take forward that work. We know for sure that advocacy is likely to be needed probably towards the back end of 2024 to continue to support some important multilateral health and education institutions, which a lot of you will be very familiar with, some of which are going to be needing additional financial support from international donors like the UK from next year. The kind of funding cycles all need renewing over that period of time. So this includes the next replenishment of the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB and malaria. It includes Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and also the Global Partnership for Education, all of which do really important work. So we'll let you know the specific timescales around advocacy with those replenishments and any policy changes that we need about their work as soon as we know it later in the year. And then kind of lastly, really, on this sort of looking forward, we're clearly going to have a general election at some time quite soon, which means that whoever wins we're going to need to keep their minds focused on financing the Sustainable Development Goals. And so it's time probably for me to give you advance notice that our February action, seems that we're only just announcing the January one, but our February action will be to start thinking about how you might want to influence your prospective parliamentary candidates in your constituency. And we are going to be issuing some information, some advice, some guidance. This is obviously going to be different in every constituency, and we're happy to talk to you all individually about what that might mean for you. Now, we don't know exactly the timing of when the election will be announced, but we do want to move sooner rather than later. There's some good indications that it could be sooner in the year, although the Prime Minister has said not, or has not said not, but he's indicated not. Take that as he will. So we think it's important to be prepared now, and there is a chance it could be sooner rather than later. So I am going to hold that for a second. Normally at this point, I would ask another member of the team, Aurora or somebody, to share what we've been hearing from your activities around the UK. Now, I think we reported the London group's stall on the SDGs just before the Christmas break, so I don't want to repeat ourselves. And we don't know of any other stalls that were reported. So I'm going to open the floor for a second to hear anybody who would like to say anything about their group's activities or your individual activities over December that might not have been shared yet. So over to you.
Okay.
Naveed, it's Ricky. With regard to results, we've had an extended Christmas and Hogmanay holiday, so I apologise for that. But something's been going on in the Scottish Parliament. One of our MSPs has drafted a bill called Wellbeing and Sustainable Development. And it's basically very good. I mean, the idea is that any Scottish Parliament policy would be directed by principles of sustainable development and well-being, and she intends that also to include a future generations commissioner, which I understand they have one of those in Wales, and it's a very useful kind of role to safeguard progress on the on climate change or climate justice and that sort of thing. So it's quite exciting, and it's been approved for going through to the next consultation stage. There are some consultations coming up. So within the scope of the Scottish Parliament, at least, that's something quite progressive going on.
Wow, thank you for sharing that, Ricky. We'd love to hear developments and how that kind of relates to international development specifically as that sort of develops through the legal process. That's really interesting. Thank you. And I had heard about the Wales situation a bit. I don't know a lot about it, but I knew that was there. Does anyone else have anything they'd like to share before we move on? So I didn't really mean to put people on the spot, but I have.
Just to say that the virtual group has been pinging things around, sharing information and signing letters, and I'm just looking to see what we've been up to. But there's been quite a lot of footfall in that group, so I was just looking to see what there was. Maybe Kemi or what you call it would like to say some more. Just looking to see. Tony, you're in that group, aren't you, as well? But there's been a lot of sharing of information, which has been great.
Thank you for mentioning the online group, because I haven't mentioned it for a little while, and obviously that's really great that we've now got that non-geographically specific group, and I'm really glad to hear that you've been chatting with each other before kind of reconvening for the new year.
Yeah. Can I say something, Naveed?
Please.
Okay. Yeah, so for me anyway, because I actually just joined the group the tail end of December. And I think that we're already working on a paper, on a letter and that they had drafted, and they got a reply back towards the end of the year from the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, which replaced the DFID. So yeah, so for me, I mean, it was kind of like nice just joining that meeting for the first time and just getting to know what they were up to. I found it very, very, I was very optimistic about the meeting and the way the meeting went. And I kind of like the idea that one of the things that was discussed at that meeting was how we were going to focus on specifics in how we were going to, tackle that, whether we were going to look at themes broadly or look at themes specifically, because I know they were dealing with girls' education just as I joined. And they'd gotten the feedback, and then the feedback wasn't, I think someone, I can't remember who it was, that said in the group that, okay, yeah, the FCDO just referred back to another department without giving a specific answer. And we wanted to kind of explore that in the new year, how we're going to deal with replies that don't actually deal with the issues other than referring us back to another department. Yeah, so that's one of the things that kind of resonated with me, and and really just to kind of look at, what are we going to focus on and break down the SDG targets. Are we going to focus on this target this month, or are we going to target it quarterly, and instead of just jumping around, just focus on one target, look at that for 3 months and then move on to something else. So that's one of the things we kind of talked about.
Great. Thanks, Kenny. So yeah, I think we're going to continue as we have been in previous years to try and give you very specific things to do and hopefully be able to explain why. You're going to hear a little bit more about the SDGs a little bit later on, so I'll hold that for a second. So obviously, as I said, this month is about planning, given that we don't know everything that we need to about the year at the moment, and things will develop. But yeah, we're going to talk about the SDGs a little bit later. So I just want to say thank you again to all of you for all of you done throughout the year. And I'd like to just introduce our guest speaker now, if that's all right. So I see she's on the call. It's my very great pleasure to introduce the Chief Executive Officer of Results UK, Kitty Arie, who has now steered the organisation over the last year or more, I think. And we really want to invite her to speak about our renewed organisational strategy, and to say a little bit about what that process has been like and how we've got there. Some of you will have met Kitty at our national conference, and I hope this evening will be a good chance to find out a bit more about the way she hopes to lead the organisation in the coming years and to meet the various challenges that the world is going to continue to throw at us. Kitty will start with a short presentation about our strategy rather than the usual pre-arranged questions. And after that, we'll open up the floor to questions in the normal way. It seemed like a kind of better way into the sort of strategic view of the organisation that we're hoping to have. So Kitty, a big welcome to you.
Thanks, David.
So thank you for joining us. As I said, obviously I don't need to introduce to you who we've got on this call, but I'll hand straight over to you to introduce yourself, as we always do with our guest speakers. If you could say, for those who haven't met you yet, a little bit about your background, how you came to be involved in international development work, and what's driving you to lead the work of Results.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. It is a privilege to be here tonight, so thank you very much for inviting me. I can hear that the Sainsbury's has just arrived and my children are in charge of unloading it, so I hope that this goes smoothly while I'm speaking to you. So please excuse the disturbance and noise in the background if you hear it. How I came into international development is a long story, so I won't go into the detail of it, but basically I've always been very political. And when I graduated from university, I got a job at a magazine as a researcher and a fact checker. And I really got interested in working on the articles that were about foreign affairs and international development. And after that, I went to graduate school, and I was fortunate to get a job writing public policy case studies for the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, which were meant to help professors explain really big issues in the international development space. And most of the other people on staff were a lot older and didn't want to do the travel. And so because I was younger and I really wanted to travel, they gave me a lot of great case studies to research and write about. And so I wrote about things like the World Bank and anti-poverty programs that countries were initiating. And so it was a great introduction into the sort of policy angle of international development. And then I got a job at Save the Children, where I worked for 14 years at Save the Children UK and then at Save the Children International. And I worked in the humanitarian department, and then I moved into the development department, and I led their campaign on child survival, which really aligns well, I think, with the work that Results does. And so during lockdown, I was thinking about applying for new jobs. And I knew Erin, the former executive director of Results, because we had worked together on some coalition campaigns in the UK. And so I applied to the job at Results and have been there for just over a year. So that's kind of how I got into international development. And I'm very, very happy to be where I am now. There's a huge job in front of us, which is part of the reason for me joining this call today, this evening, to talk to you a little bit about the strategy that we have laid out for how we're going to continue to adapt and achieve change. And also, I think, taking on board the challenges and opportunities that Naveed has just talked a little bit about. So should we go?
Yeah, thanks, Kitty. So I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions about your background and your ideas about international development, as well as the strategy that you're just about to unveil. We're going to hold all of that until after your presentation. So I'm going to try and share the screen, and hopefully this is going to work. Kitty, over to you, I think, to just run into your presentation.
Great. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to start by reminding us of what we already do and know as an organization before moving on to the challenges and opportunities in the world, which we need to take account of and respond to. And then talking about how these will help shape what we do in the coming years to continue our mission to create the public and political will to end poverty by enabling people to exercise their own personal and political power for change. So slide 2. Great. So I hope that you'll be reassured to see these words at the top of our strategy here. Our fundamental purpose hasn't changed. However, as always, the world around us has changed, and we need to calibrate our direction and our work to make sure we're as relevant and as effective as we can be. And, you know, all organizations have to do this periodically. So this is a time of change for us. A new thing in the language in the second paragraph here on this slide is the explicit recognition that we haven't been doing enough to deal with the legacy of colonialism and racism. And in fact, in many ways, those of us working in international development have been perpetuating it. So, for example, while we applaud the work of the global partnerships we have, such as Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, you know, we ask ourselves, who runs it? Who sets its goals? We saw the injustice that can occur in this regard in the COVID-19 response, for example, where the world largely failed to make sure that everyone had equal access to vaccines, despite there being initiatives such as COVAX to do this. And we think the governance of international institutions being with the rich countries is a big part of the problem. You'll have seen Results doing more on this in recent years, such as talking more openly about racism and inviting speakers with direct experience of issues to help inform our work. This has always been important, but it's essential that we are open to addressing these injustices if we're going to achieve our goals on poverty. Next. So since 2015, as most of you on the call already know, Results has used the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals to conceptualize our mission to end poverty and to remind us how the various aspects of poverty and unsustainable practices in the world reinforce each other. We don't and can't work on them all, but we focus on the ones where we think we can have the most impact, given our history and expertise as an organization and the opportunities we have to influence the UK government to make changes that we want to see. As you know, sometimes we talk about the goals all together, as we did in December when we asked you to consider promoting the concept of the goals to help us focus political will. We focus particularly on SDG 2, ending hunger, when we do our work on nutrition. And for example, since 2013, the amazing work many of you have done to promote the Nutrition for Growth agenda, started by David Cameron, which has unblocked billions of dollars in funding to fight malnutrition. We focus a lot of our energy on SDG 3, Health for All, particularly for our work to end the TB epidemic and to ensure that vital vaccinations are available to children wherever they live in the world, particularly those who miss out on vaccinations altogether and are therefore more likely to suffer unnecessarily from easily treatable diseases. We do a lot of work on SDG 4, quality education for all, working to ensure children have access to education, especially the most marginalized, such as girls, children with disabilities, those affected by emergencies. And also in recent years, we've been working on the quality of education outcomes, what we call the functional literacy and numeracy. A lot of the other goals are of great relevance to our work, particularly SDG 5 on gender equality, SDG 13 on climate change, and SDG 17 on global partnerships that we need to make changes at scale, and others as well. Next. Results has been able to get funding to support our staff over the years, both to help you take action on these issues, particularly through the work of the grassroots team, and to hire policy and parliamentary staff to help develop expertise and to build the professional relationships with civil servants, experts, and parliamentarians needed to promote our advocacy on an ongoing basis. Those of you who've been around for a long time will have seen the growth of the staff-led work, but the funding of our grassroots hasn't kept pace, and this isn't by choice, but it's because the priorities of the relatively few funders that we do have who support advocacy, they aren't as a rule committed to democratic political engagement as a tool. And where they do, they recognize the achievements you all make, but funders are often agnostic about how change happens, and we need to persuade more of them about the value of grassroots methodology, our grassroots methodology. So that's something that we're definitely looking into. Next. We also know that there was a very fruitful discussion on this at day 2 of the national conference back in July about how the world of campaigning is changing, particularly reflecting how the ways in which the general public is engaging with moral and political issues. This is changing around us very quickly, and we need to work out how our methodology needs to change to ensure that we continue to demonstrate the results is a way of helping people to make positive change via their constructive engagement with the political process which we've always done, but how can we do that differently? So here are some examples. Next. So we need to recognize that the global context around us changes, as I mentioned just now, and we need to change our approach with it. So the problems we see are getting more complex and interrelated. I think the external challenges in the world shown on this slide will be familiar to you, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts about how the implications of these affect us later on. But these are just a few of the relevant ones to sort of demonstrate the context that's changing around us. So the big question for us has been, how does results respond to all of this? We have decided to focus on a few of these strategic challenges to guide how we work over the next few years, and where to put our energies, where to prioritize our search for additional fundraising to support our work, and what issues we talk most about, given our historic expertise on things like health and education. So the purpose of this has led us to think about directing our activities to the most effective ways to achieve our mission to end poverty through political engagement. And this slide shows the things that we think that we need to work on over the next few years. Some of these are quite tough long-term challenges, but they're also things that we think that we can't shy away from. So this is a list of some of the challenges that we feel that we are facing. Next. So all of that said, this has led us to formulate our broad goals as results, as opposed to issue-specific or time-specific objective. These are our 4 organizational objectives. So I think it's worth just spending a minute on this slide. So I'll read them out. So our first one is to shift power and amplify the voices of people who want to fight global poverty, ensuring that those experiencing poverty are included in decision-making. Second is to ensure that globally the resources mobilized, policy changes, and necessary political will are applied to enable everyone to access adequate healthcare, education, nutrition, and economic opportunities. To advocate for global systems and structures, from multilateral bodies to food systems that are inclusive and equitable, meeting the needs of everyone in the global population in the 21st century. And to ensure that Results becomes an agile and sustainable organization able to support its mission. Next, I think we've got one more. So lastly, before we move on to your questions, I thought I would leave you with a few questions of my own, which I hope might prompt some ideas and thoughts to get the discussion going. We don't have to go through these one by one. And, we can also put them in the chat to stimulate discussion. But I thought it might be useful to hear from you what you think about these goals, and we can put the goals back up on the screen. How does shifting power away from the UK affect the work of Results? How should we talk about poverty and inequality differently going forward? And how can we continue to help people engage with the political process to affect change? So if we put those in the chat, maybe we could go back to the slide that has our goals, and so everybody could see those as we discuss and take questions and comments.
Thank you, Kitty. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. So thank you for your presentation, which I think shows a certain amount of continuity of the ways we've been basing our work on the Sustainable Development Goals in recent years, but also that recognition of the need to adapt to a changing world, both in relation to the nature of power structures, but also in relation to the way that we try to help people organize themselves to interact with political systems. So to take us further into this kind of range of topics, really, I'm going to open up the floor as usual. Please introduce yourself to Kitty before you ask your question. Alternatively, there is the Zoom chat box, as always. And I'm also going to have my my mobile on, so if you want to text in, the number to text me has just gone into the chat box, which is 07906 662 571. That's 07906 662 571. So over to the first question, if anyone would just like to open up and say hello.
There are a couple of questions in the chat that I can see, or some comments actually. So the first one around shifting power, I think this is a really excellent thing to do. Struggle.
In case anybody can't see those, do you want to read out the question?
Yeah. So the comment is, I think this is a really excellent thing to do, shifting power, but struggle to imagine what it really looks like as a practice within Results. I mean, I think this is an excellent comment, and it's something that I have been thinking about because we're having an away day next week with the whole team, and how we actually adopt that as an ethos for our organization, but apply it is the real question, because we are an organization based in the UK. Our advocacy targets are the UK government and some global multilateral organizations. What does it really mean to shift the power in our context? So I think that the way I see it is looking at the ways in which we can make sure that the policies and change that we're representing are genuinely changes that have been that we are informed by our partners and by communities in those countries where we want to see the change happen, is the first one. I think the other thing is encouraging the UK government itself to shift power is a really big opportunity. For a long time, it has been a real international development heavyweight over the years. I'm not talking the most recent years, but you know, over the last, I would say 10, 15 years, it has really punched above its weight and has had a real leadership role in this space. And I think that it can do more as it comes back into wanting to regain some of that leadership that it previously had, perhaps with a new government coming in, that they might want to think and be considerate about how they could adopt this sort of an ethos themselves. And I think that they have shown some signs there, but what it really means as a donor, as a rich country, what they could do differently, I think will be could be transformative.
Thank you, Kitty. There's a couple of other questions here that was one just a little bit higher up in the chat, which was what is meant by food systems. That would be quite helpful to unpack. I think well,
food systems, and I was also going to maybe link that to what are the differences between the new strategic goals and the previous, with a big caveat here, because I was not around when we developed the previous strategic goals, and I have to admit I'm not 100% sure what they are, but I do know that the goals that we have set out here and our forward thinking and our strategy for results going forward is going to be dealing much more with systemic change and looking at things like food systems as opposed to quick fixes or ways of influencing policy that are not necessarily going to address the root causes that are sometimes embedded in the systems that we want to change. So I think that for me, what's really different about what we're trying to do and is 100% responsive to the external environment that we're now working in, there's an expectation that as advocates, we're going to take a more sophisticated approach and really try to address some of the root causes of the problems that we're trying to fix. And it's not that these things weren't around previously as like a foundation for what you're trying to do. But I think that what's changed is that there is the expectation is also linked to your legitimacy as an organization and to your advocacy, because you have to be really grappling with why these why things persist that we want to see changed. And unless we get underneath them and address the core discrimination against certain groups of people, for example, or the entrenched poverty because certain groups of people don't have access to healthcare, or those sort of issues, then we're actually not going to make the progress that we need to make. So I see this both, you know, our strategy going forward as in response to the challenges that we're facing, but also if we want to continue to have impact, it's really the only way it's going to work.
Thanks, Kitty. I've seen a follow-up question from Pete in the chat about, I'm guessing it's about follow-up on the goals. But I've been at this point because I kind of do broadly remember our previous way we formulated the goals. I had to look, just get them up on screen, I have to admit. But just for information, looking backwards, we didn't talk more about that systematic change explicitly, the way that Kitty was just talking about. We jumped straight into kind of the issues. So we had goal 1, which was called citizen voice, which is kind of people raising their voices. So people like yourselves, also people around the world. We had goal 2, which was health. So all of the different health issues we're working on, including nutrition, and including universal health coverage. Then goal 3 was education for all. Goal 4 was economic opportunity. And then we had a kind of catch-all for, I suppose, if you like, 0.7 of funding for this, which was called development, finance and transition. So it's much more kind of issue-based, with the exception of the first one. And obviously, in terms of following up, that, you know, we do report both to our donors, but also to our board of trustees on how we kind of try and achieve those goals over the strategic period. And I don't want to sort of take us on a side note now, but that again, for the goals that you've just seen put up on screen for the new period. Sorry, I've just taken us off the goals there, put them back again. Obviously, again, we're going to have to create a new set of metrics for the new formulation, and that's something that we've started to do, and we're expecting, you know, our board to kind of check on whether we're actually doing anything on those.
I think the other thing, Naveed, is that when I first came in, and Results was really very well known for a lot of the work it did on issue areas, which it still is, and also focusing a lot on replenishments, for example, and making sure that the UK government made sufficient pledges and followed through on those pledges for specific issue areas. And I think that we are now looking one step beyond that, which is around things like how that money is spent, making sure that it is spent equitably. And so it is about responding to a slightly broader set of problems in order to achieve those SDGs. So, and we're not the only ones who've actually changed in this way and have taken this step forward. And so that's what I mean by also saying that we're also responding to the external challenges and environment that we find ourselves in. But it's not good enough just to raise a lot of money. We and the UK government should have something to say about what that money is spent on, how it is spent, making sure that it is spent equitably and in a timely fashion. So those are some of the ways in which I think that this new strategy is different from the previous one and the previous goals.
Thanks, Kitty. There's a few questions coming in the chat. I do want to open it up to people to just shout out again as well. But there's a couple of different really levels. One, it's very much at the kind of strategic level, it seems to me, is from Kathy, who's written, what happened to the slogan, no one left behind? So the leave no one behind under the SDGs. Used a lot of the start of the process. How does that fit with changing power structures? I think that's a really great question.
It is. And I think that actually we have not abandoned the slogan, no one left behind. And it fits, I think, squarely within the changing power structures because it's all about equity. And we worked really hard as advocates to make sure that the SDGs, when they were designed, had that as a slogan, no one left behind, and also looking at making sure that, you know, no goal is going to be met unless it's met for everyone. And that means that no one can be left behind. How that fits with the changing power structure is to try to decentralize the decision-making about how to actually achieve that and to make sure we really do leave no one behind. But the way to do that is to not think up all of the design of the programs or the interventions or the money or who it's going to in London. It's actually about a much more inclusive decision-making process. And that's why I mentioned it was really important that this is not just for us. One of the things we need to do is convince the UK government that they also need to change power structures. They need to decentralize their own decision-making and include more voices. And that's the only way, I believe, that we're actually going to meet the SDGs, because the SDGs will only be met if no one is left behind. So I see those two things as linked, 100% linked, and no one left behind is still definitely a slogan and a call and a description of absolutely what we are still trying to do.
Thanks. I see some really good comments in the chat around that theme of accountability for both ourselves and others to achieve what they say they're going to set out to do. And we can maybe develop that conversation, but I just want to make some space for people with this before sort of moving on to a totally different question. I'd like to make some space for people to sort of reflect on what they've just heard from you, and just continue this this train on equality, equity, leaving no one behind, and the systemic change that we think we need to achieve all of that. Anyone want to just open your mic and comment or ask a question about that?
Hey, what?
Hello, Kitty. It's Ricky again from Edinburgh.
Right.
I just got kind of 100 thoughts in my head, so I'll try not to express all of them. As an example of all, like everywhere in the world having a voice, can we take COP28? Because it's UN and in theory 192 countries turn up, but it still boils down to a lot of mechanisms by which wealthy countries, including the UK, have to donate or surrender large amounts of money or, profit potential. And that's funding, the loss and damages or the, this measure or that measure or the other measure. And in the end, most of what our campaigning has been is writing to our MPs or the Prime Minister to say, pledge more money, give more money.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering, is that going to change? Are we still going to be writing a letter each month, usually asking for money? And if it's, is there a cleverer way of getting, are we going to be Are we going to be supporting other initiatives, other NGOs that distribute money differently? Are we going to be communicating directly with, the poorer countries of the world? Because there's about 150 of them, I should think. So that's quite a task. So
I mean, it's a really good question. I don't actually think so. I think that our main target is still the UK government, right? And we still do need them to disperse their money in ways that we think make the most sense. And so it will still always be a core part of what we do, is to try to influence them on how they divvy up that money. Now, we'd like for that budget to be bigger. Again, we'd want them to go back to 0.7%. But in the interim, they still do have quite a lot of money, and there are prioritizations that that they need to make about how they spend that money. So that will still be really important. I think where the other countries come into it, the reason I think it's important to think about how we might be influencing them to think differently, not only about the money that they have to spend, but how they spend it. And I know that we have always thought about how they spend it, and we have done a lot on accountability. But I think that what we're proposing here is to try to pressure them to think even more long term, and also about the ways in which they spend their money, so that we can, going back to that previous point about leaving no one behind. So it's not just good enough to make a pledge to, a multilateral and leave it at that. They should have something to say about how that money is spent. They should, in their own effort to hold the multilateral accountable, have something to say about the feedback on how equitably that was spent. Or, for example, in Gavi, there are gender markers around how Gavi funding is actually distributed at the country level. It would be great if the UK government required some visibility on how those gender markers are fed back to the Gavi board. There's a checklist, and that's part of the checklist. It would be nice if the UK government said, we'd like to see that to make sure that our money is being spent in the ways that we want it to be spent.
But
so
it would be great.
Some things like that.
It would be great if those health markers were actually written by Pakistani health workers in Pakistan.
Yeah.
African health workers in whichever African country, wouldn't it? So
absolutely,
it's a slightly different mechanism. But that's very helpful. Thank you very much indeed.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
That would be, and thank you, Kitty. Jill's been waiting patiently with her hand up. I'll hand over to Jill.
Hi there, Kitty. Thanks for that. The T in results, the T stands for trim tabbing. I don't think maybe Peter remembers what the whole thing is, but that's always been a great source of inspiration for me. And the trim tab is the tiny little thing on a rudder of a boat that if you change that tiny little thing, it will change the course of the whole ocean liner or the aeroplane or whatever. And that's what the T stands for. And it's doing those small actions that actually make a big difference. And it's celebrating the power of the individual voice when there's a lot of individual voices, but it's empowering people to know that their voice makes a difference. And with our shrinking advocacy group, I think my question is around clarity, that people need to know what we're doing, the small actions that we're taking that will make a big difference, that will bring about systematic change.
Absolutely.
And I just slightly worried if we start talking about systematic change, it'll be too big for people to get a handle on. But if I'm writing to my MP as an individual saying, look, we want you to be accountable for how the Gavi money is spent or whatever, even if it's a complex issue, if I understand what I'm asking and I can do that persuasively, I think we all need to be on board with those small actions and not be overawed by systemic change and the other words. I just think
I think
that's
you're exactly
major.
right, though, Gil. I think that you are right, and we probably should have made it really clear that what we're talking about here is the sort of the strategy that kind of underpins what we're going to do. But I agree, we would never use this language in an action, for example. We would always, the action's actually not going to change very much. We would still be looking for where we can have the most impact on the things that we're trying to change around health and education and nutrition. And so, but what we might be looking at is how we could influence the government to do some things a little bit differently themselves. But the actions will still be quite similar. The language will be quite similar, but I think that what we'll be trying to do is make some targeted actions that are going to actually support the government to advance this kind of agenda themselves. That's how I would see it. But you are right. We don't want to overcomplicate anything. And this is not the sort of language that we would ever use in an action or in public, for example. We might talk about systemic change or multilaterals, but we would describe what we actually mean by that, or we would actually use a description instead of those words. So I think that you're right. And this is not intended to suggest that we're going to make things any more complicated. It's just to say that the world that we're trying to adapt to and continue to have impact in through those small changes is getting awfully complex around us. And how do we navigate that in a really responsible way so that we are still cutting edge and relevant and credible, but also still able to pinpoint those things where we think the government can do a better job, can offer more and better money. And I think that that's still going to be our USP, but it's just a recognition that everything around us is getting awfully complex. And how are we going to cut through that? What we're trying to do is understand that complexity, but then still be able to boil it down to a place where we still have a role. We still have a really important role to play. And we're going to make sure that we still have actions that are simple and, an MP can understand them, get their head around it and feel pressure to actually do something. We don't want to turn them off by jargon, but at the same time, we need them to actually step up and take some action in this changing world and land somewhere that is going to continue to have impact.
Thanks.
David, I don't know if there's anything you want to add on that as the sort of thinker on some of the actions that we do.
No, I think I don't. I did want to observe a little earlier on. I think it's still relevant that we're not only about asking for money, although that's really important, but it's kind of about sometimes we have policy change, things that we want to see. So, for example, we've worked on how the UK designs nutrition programs, how much we get, whether we're doing the right things with that money and getting the most use for it. But also, I see in those new formulation of our goals something around, when we're talking about ceding power, we're making actual commitments that one day we hope that other countries will be less disproportionately unpowerful. Britain is disproportionately powerful because it has a lot of money and a lot of reach, and we want other countries to have more say over their own lives, more help, more ability to help their populations. And so there will be a slow change, but it will involve working to change the system, change international structures at the same time as, we can only argue for that at the particular moments where we have something to ask the government, and it may well continue to be around when there's a money ask. So yeah, we want to continue to fund the Global Fund. And by the way, can you make sure that when it approaches countries for proposals for work, that it does X, Y, and Z? So I was thinking around how those, rather as Kitty was saying, how those kind of strategic, big, potentially daunting questions can link with our particular moments around individual multilaterals or individual funds. I don't think we've got time for every question, but I see a really important one just coming from Pete. Are we actually talking about changing global structures? Pete, do you want to unpack that a little bit?
Sure. It was something you said about a minute ago about addressing global structures, and this is new talk that I'm hearing from results. What I understand that we've been working on is in creating the political will, which means working with our governments. What do you mean by changing global structures?
Do you want me, Kitty, do you want me to take that since I raised the question, or do you want
You can start, yeah.
So I don't think they're different things. Yeah, we do need to continue influencing our government. That's what we're about. You can have a very ambitious, idealistic view of how you want to change the world, and at the same time start from where you are. I don't know if I'm answering your question. I'm trying. And we're not. I don't think we can pretend that suddenly they're going to change overnight and think, oh yeah, you're completely right. We must completely reform the World Trade Organization. That's probably not going to happen. But we are looking at small opportunities to change the world. And let's face it, it's changing anyway, whether the British government like it or not. The power dynamics geopolitically are changing. And I just think we need to have an awareness of those changes and make sure that they move in a positive direction as we do the things that we do anyway, in trying to forge those positive relationships with government on whatever it might be. And there's plenty of powerful forces in the world going in the opposite direction. So that's my answer, but it's kind of a personal one rather than an organizational one.
Okay, Naveed, can you just conjure up out of your consciousness an example of what you mean?
Yeah, so I think something like changing the rules of engagement of one of the global funds would be one. We know that there's a lot of people, particularly on the right of politics, but not exclusively, who are challenging multilateralism at the moment and possibly don't want us to actually cooperate with each other in the world to achieve goods. We really need to argue for that, against that, I think. Perhaps we don't all on this call. I certainly do. I'd like to see a world in which the British government plays a cooperative role with other nations rather than just sees itself as primarily working in the national interest and having some handouts to sort of ameliorate that. That's kind of the thing I mean.
Okay, I hear you. Thank you.
So I feel I've taken away from a speaker.
No, not at all. I think that's a good example. I was also thinking about Gavi because I brought that up in the slides as an example. Looking at changing global structures, thinking about who's on the Gavi board, getting the UK government to argue for a better balance of Gavi recipient countries, so the countries that receive Gavi funding to purchase those vaccines, versus the donor countries would be a really good example, I think. And there is a UK representative on the Gavi board currently, and we have a relationship with her, and she's in a position to make those sort of suggestions at board level. So those sorts of things, I think, are certainly within our sphere of influence, which probably would be a really good thing to support the UK government to do and to take a leadership role on.
Ah, all right, that's good. Thank you.
Mhm.
I feel we're moving into really like kind of exalted high-level territory here, and I really find it's a terrible time to cut this conversation, but we have to. But yeah, I hope this has seemed like kind of an evolution of what some of the things we've been doing, seeing them in a slightly different way because of the needing to, you know, just respond to the world that's around us. And I am going to put in the chat the actual wording of the strategic plan, which is online, so you can read it for yourselves. And please do keep coming to us with these questions. We spent a year or so trying to work out what would be the best definition of what we need to do as results in this next few years. And, you know, we won't have got it 100% right. This is our best shot, and we'd love to hear some responses and some ideas for how this is actually going to be real. I think, Pete, your question was a great one about, like, what does this actually mean? So please be reassured that our board of trustees actively hold results staff accountable for making progress on the direction of travel that we've set for ourselves. And in particular, I wanted to mention that our grassroots trustees, Cameron and Cush, are keeping a close eye on how we propose to renew the offer we make to the public to get involved as grassroots campaigners. So those are some things that I thought it would be important just to say. I did also want to do one flag up one thing before we leave this call, which is that our founder, Sam Daly-Harris, has written a new edition of his book, Reclaiming Our Democracy. Now, if you don't know it, this book's a fascinating account of how his idea about the engagement of citizens in politics to achieve global goals has kind of turned into organisations such as the results we know today. And I think it is relevant today as when he first had the idea in the 70s. Now, he's offered to come and speak at a grassroots conference call in the next few months. And I assume this would be of interest to people, but I just wondered if that sounds like a useful thing. Can see a couple of nods. I'm going to.
I would love that.
I can't see everybody.
Wonderful idea.
Great.
Yeah, that would be great.
I can see. Oh, yeah, I can see a lot of thumbs up. Wonderful. Well, we'll try and organise that with him and try and find a day that works for him and for us. I just think he's always a really powerful speaker. Jill, yeah, and Princess, brilliant. Thank you, everybody who's given some endorsement for that idea. Now, look, I want to respect evenings. So for those of you who need to get away, we'll finish this call. The next one will be back to the usual first Tuesday of February. And we'll be talking about campaigning on global poverty during an election, as I said earlier. I've just put in the chat the January materials. So the issues that I said earlier on that we think we're going to work on, it includes those and suggests how you might want to meet with each other or just basically think about those issues and plan what your year of campaigning might look like. For now, if you're not staying, thank you as always for your support for results and for all of your advocacy efforts throughout the year. So yeah, as I said, I'll keep the line open for those of you who want to chat informally, but for everyone who needs to leave now, thank you so much for joining us and enjoy the rest of your evenings.